On the 16th of November 2007, authorities received a call from the villagers of Nikolskaya, Russia, saying that between 29 and 35 people had bunkered down in an underground cave. These individuals were later discovered to be members of the True Russian Orthodox Church, a fanatical cult that believed that doomsday was fast approaching. The cult members refused to come out or even speak to anyone under strict orders from their leader, 43-year-old Pyotr Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov had told his followers that they were the chosen ones, arbiters of who gets to go to heaven or hell, and with the apocalypse almost upon them, the bunker would be the only safe place they could survive. Their supplies included tanks of gasoline, which they threatened to blow up if anyone tried to remove them. So this ordeal lasted almost 6 months. Rescue services and the police set up camp around the cave, joined by global media outlets that reported almost daily after discovering the cult's descent. Despite the harsh Russian winter and fierce spring floods, the group was determined to last until Judgment Day, which they believed would be on May the 28th, 2008. But they wouldn't make it until then, for a disturbing reason. Hello, and welcome to my channel. Make sure you're subscribed to hear about more crimes and other oddities from around the world. Now, let's lift the thin veil. Pyotr Kuznetsov was born in 1964 in Belarus, or as it was known then, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, under the control of the Soviet Union. Not much is known about his family other than the fact that they were extremely religious and members of the Russian Orthodox Church, which today is the major sect of Christianity in Russia. To give this a little context, I want to briefly explain how religion was regarded in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had an extremely negative attitude towards organized religion. They tried to wipe it out, encouraging scientific atheism and controlling what people could believe and practice. Even though most religions were never officially outlawed, churches, synagogues, and mosques were limited. The state established atheism as the only scientific truth. Soviet authorities forbade the criticism of atheism and agnosticism until 1936. And criticism of the state's anti-religious policies could lead to forced retirement. If you were caught talking about religion, you could be harassed or incarcerated in camps or mental hospitals. But people still held on to their faith, meeting secretly in homes or even out in the woods. Many families kept their traditions alive, even if they couldn't go to church openly. So, while the government wanted to erase religion, it still grew to be a part of Russian culture and identity. As it stands today, the Russian Orthodoxy is the largest sect of Christianity in Russia, with about 100 million members in Russia and about 100 million more members worldwide. I realize this is a very general explanation, and there is much more nuance to this because tolerance towards religions did change under different leaders. The point I want to make is that organized religion was seen to clash directly with Marxist-Leninist ideals, and therefore seen as incompatible. Anyway, back to the video. From the little information available about Kuznetsov's life growing up, it seems to have been ordinary by all accounts. He was described as a regular, studious child in school who had a good sense of humor. He was ambitious, intelligent, and headed towards higher education. In his 20s, he graduated from the Penza Civil Engineering Institute as a certified civil engineer and then gained 2 other degrees. In 1989, Kuznetsov got married and had a son, but that life didn't suit him, so he left them in 1997 and returned to his hometown in Belarus. Obtaining what many of us in the UK or USA would consider public information, especially on individuals, is not an easy task in Russia due to their stricter privacy laws, and given that these events started in the late 90s, there is not much information available on what Kuznetsov was up to until the early 2000s. Leading up to the early 2000s, Kuznetsov started to consider Russian Orthodox Christianity a large part of his life, and he had developed such an obsession with it that he tried to surrender his life completely to the God he believed in. His religious views eventually morphed from devoted to radical. He quit his job as an engineer, sold all his possessions, and became a monk, renaming himself to Brother Maxim and later Father Pyotr. He traveled across the country as a monk for the Russian Orthodox Church, but began working on his own manifestos. Kuznetsov became consumed by his obsession with the Bible, dissecting every word and developing his own unique interpretations of the scriptures. Driven by these personal revelations, he began writing his own religious texts, using them as a tool to sway others to his way of thinking. After Kuznetsov's cult did what it did in 2008, the Russian government banned these books completely and destroyed any existing copies. Because of this, it's unknown today exactly what was in these writings. However, it is claimed that they were filled with hateful rhetoric, laced with venom against other religions and races. Another point described by journalists was the prediction that doomsday would take place in May 2008, and the only people who would be safe in the afterlife were his followers, because they would be the ones deciding who went to heaven or hell. Kuznetsov would distribute these controversial books at church. In 2004, Kuznetsov asked the Archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church for permission to build a chapel in the Bykovsky district. It's unclear why he picked that specific location, but he eventually moved there even after the church refused his proposal. Kuznetsov couldn't stand the rejection, the crushing of his newfound dreams of permanent devotion, and he started to separate himself from the church. Eventually, he set out on a mission across Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, spreading his radical interpretation of the Russian Orthodox doctrine, which he would later call the True Russian Orthodox Church. Armed with countless copies of his manifesto, his sole focus was to recruit followers. Some of these followers later offered a glimpse into how they were captivated by Kuznetsov's doctrine. One was Sergei, a 22-year-old man whose entire family were all members of the cult. Sergei revealed that it was his father, Vitaly, who was first drawn into Father Pyotr's teachings. Initially, Sergei was vehemently opposed to what Kuznetsov was preaching to his parents, but as he began to read his books and compared them to the Bible, Sergei became convinced. He claimed that everything in Kuznetsov's writings aligned perfectly with the scriptures, and eventually, he too joined the cult. In his writings, Kuznetsov tied his interpretations and doomsday predictions to intricate codes and numbers, creating an aura of mysticism around his teachings. One cult member, Nikolai Ponedelnik, spoke admiringly of Kuznetsov, calling him a very wise man and asserting that his interpretations of the Bible were so profound he believed he was a true prophet. Nikolai explained that to understand Kuznetsov's doomsday prophecy, one had to grasp the meaning behind the codes and numbers he preached. His followers, who would refer to him only as Father Pyotr, were told that barcodes, passports, tax ID, social security numbers, or any numbers that could be used to identify them were evil and contained the mark of the beast. So his followers burned their passports and any other forms of ID. Kuznetsov's obsession with numbers was especially focused on the numbers 7, 12, and 666. So when the Russian Orthodox Church in 2004 was given a tax ID number by the government and this information reached Kuznetsov, he and his followers regarded it as the downfall of the church, believing they were fraternizing with the devil. It's possible that Kuznetsov's obsession with unrelated biblical numbers was a sign of apophenia, a condition where an individual finds significant patterns in random or unrelated events. If Kuznetsov truly believed in the doomsday he preached, this could have been an early indication of schizophrenia. Yet, because he was intelligent and presented himself as a man of great wisdom, he was able to persuade his followers to buy into his apophenic delusions. In his teachings, he referenced a specific passage from the Bible, claiming that after the Orthodox Church betrayed Jesus Christ, 1,300 evenings and mornings would pass before the end times. Depending on the interpretation, this period could span either 7 years if counted in full days, or 3.5 years if counted in half days, leading directly to the spring of 2008, May the 28th, 2008 to be exact. I'm not sure how many of Kuznetsov's followers actually understood these codes and numbers. However, it's classical cult behavior to claim to possess hidden knowledge and demand followers' unquestioning faith. It's clear that Kuznetsov would later use this so-called knowledge to manipulate his followers into doing things they would not have done if not in such a group. Cult leaders often boast of their intelligence and accomplishments while offering magical solutions to their followers' problems. With his 3 degrees, he was likely the most educated person in his cult, and he used this to his advantage. He positioned himself as superior to his followers, claiming to possess a wisdom far beyond that of ordinary people. In 2007, Kuznetsov briefly reunited with his son, and together, they traveled several times to Belarus. This reunion, however, only came to light through official records, as the two were detained by Belarusian authorities for lacking proper documentation. The Belarusian police reached out to Russia for verification of the Kuznetsov's citizenship, but with no timely response, he was ultimately deported back to Russia. This marked yet another rejection in Kuznetsov's life, first by his church and now by his own government. This series of events may have further fueled his growing resentment and radical beliefs. Following his deportation from Belarus, Kuznetsov settled near the village of Nikolskaya, a secluded hamlet nestled in the forests near the Volga River, about 900 kilometers east of Moscow, bringing along his followers from abroad. They began living together in a communal setting, consisting of 5 houses, establishing a prayer room where they could practice their beliefs in isolation. They had also erected a large wooden cross where they prayed, which is pretty much the only thing they did. Word of Kuznetsov's teachings soon spread, drawing visitors from Belarus and Ukraine, many of whom were captivated by his way of life. These new converts left their old lives behind. It wasn't a large number by any account, considering the sheer number of people he likely spoke to across Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, but he had gathered 35 deeply devoted followers, 4 of them children, all of whom were captivated by his fanatical beliefs and would hang on to every word he said. Family members of the followers recalled that their loved ones were living normal, peaceful lives before they crossed paths with Kuznetsov. But once they met him, everything changed. They described him as having an almost hypnotic power over his followers, leading to dramatic transformations in their behavior. One family member recounted, he would visit people's homes, the rich ones, not the poor, and it was like he had a hypnotic hold over them. They sold their homes, everything they had, and gave all their money to him. Kuznetsov also preached a strict, natural lifestyle. His followers were required to grow their own food, completely avoiding anything processed or that had a barcode. They were forbidden from using electricity, watching TV, accessing the internet, having a cell phone, or even using a radio. According to Father Pyotr, all these things were evil. Anything that connected his followers to the outside world was deemed dangerous. Followers weren't allowed to work paid jobs outside of the commune. The children were barred from attending school, and all communication with family and friends was severed. This isolation was crucial to controlling the followers. By cutting off every external influence, he became their sole source of information, the only link to the outside world. He tightly restricted the narrative within the cult, ensuring that his followers had no contact with villagers or any outside voices. Kuznetsov didn't stop there, however. He also made sure that each follower took the vow of silence so no information would ever leave their own circle. Villagers would later recall seeing the cult members dressed in long black robes, silently wandering the village, completely cut off from everything they once knew. After some time, the villagers of Nikolskaya grew hostile towards this new secretive group that had settled in nearby, and some of them started to assault and harass cult members. Kuznetsov is quoted as saying that local drunks started to beat up our men and swear at our women. It is not clear how true this is, but Kuznetsov used it as a reason to convince his followers to start digging out a large cave in the side of a ravine near the Volga River, right outside the village. For nearly 2 months, the cult members toiled day and night, carving out 2 caves, with plans to create 15 underground rooms, each intended to accommodate 2 or 3 people. However, only one of these dugouts was completed with a roof and deemed habitable. The work was funded by the sale of houses that members had owned before they joined. The cave stretched 50 meters in length, with just enough headroom for an adult to stand upright. Designed in a circular shape, it featured 5 small rooms, little nooks really, dug into the sides, all connected to a central common area that they called the prayer room. They managed to create a makeshift kitchen and toilet, and even dug a small well for water access. To ensure ventilation, they cut a few holes in the ceiling, inserting pipes to bring in fresh air, with one hole doubling as a chimney. The cave was stocked with essentials like rice, grains, fruit jam, water, and tanks containing over 100 gallons of gasoline. Between late October and November the 7th, 2007, 28 cult members descended into the underground cave, with more joining later, prepared to wait out the apocalypse that they believed the True Russian Orthodox Church had foretold. Their self-imposed burial remained hidden until November the 16th. It was then that the locals in Nikolskaya started to wonder where their religious neighbors had disappeared to. None had been seen wandering around the village, nor had there been any sign of them for days. By the time the locals decided to notify the police, the cult members had barricaded themselves inside the cave. Authorities made several attempts to persuade them to come out, but most members adhered to the vow of silence they had taken upon joining, so that proved unsuccessful. Those who did respond threatened to ignite the gasoline tanks they had brought with them for cooking if anyone tried to remove them. And this wasn't an empty threat. According to some members, they were fully prepared to blow themselves up if anyone tried to force them out. In a bizarre twist, the members had entered the cave without their leader. Kuznetsov had chosen to remain above ground. He convinced them that he had a different destiny and must await new followers, and instructed them to descend into the cave and remain there, no matter what, until the end of the world. He declared that they were the chosen ones, the judges, who in the aftermath of the apocalypse would have the power to determine the fate of others, and only they were permitted to enter the cave. In the depths of the Russian winter, as snow covered the ground and temperatures hovered near freezing, Kuznetsov's followers endured the harsh conditions of the cold, cramped cave for several days, while he remained in the relative comfort of the cult's prayer house. The stark contrast between Kuznetsov's situation and that of his followers highlighted his manipulative control, as they huddled underground, clinging to the belief that they would emerge as the ultimate arbiters of humanity. The Russian Orthodox Church sent priests and monks to coax the group out of the cave. Among them was Father Alexei Bartsev, a representative of the Penza diocese, who tried to reason with them, but to no avail. The cult members steadfastly declared that they, not the Russian Orthodox priests, were the true followers of the faith, waiting for the Lord to return in glory and put an end to lawlessness. The Russian Orthodox Church strongly urged the authorities to use only peaceful methods to bring out the cult members out of the cave, hoping they could be guided back to mainstream Russian Christianity and a normal way of life. This plea for a non-violent resolution was particularly motivated by concern for the 4 children trapped inside the cave. With the temperatures inside dropping below freezing, the situation became increasingly dire, adding urgency to the need for a safe and compassionate resolution. With no straightforward solution, the authorities set up a 24-hour observation post near the cave, keeping a constant watch while trying to avoid any actions that might provoke the cultists. Inside the cave, the followers remained in a state of near constant prayer, fasting for days on end. Eventually, they communicated with the outside world only through song or by passing notes through the ventilation pipes. They made it clear that they didn't want anything from the authorities, no help, no intervention. Their sole request was to be left alone to pray in their underground sanctuary, and they asked everyone to leave. The world watched this cave, around 400 miles southeast of Moscow, in fascination as Russian authorities struggled to reason with the entrenched cultists, who were convinced that the end of the world would come that spring. Despite their desire for isolation, the situation drew immense media attention, with news outlets from around the world flocking to the site, adding even more pressure to the tense standoff. Western media outlets picked up the story, and it was being broadcasted everywhere. Authorities and emergency services knew the dangers. Due to the changing seasons, floods were imminent, people might need medical attention, food and water could run out, and the caves could collapse. The list went on. The media attention made the cult members more defensive, and they cut off communication with the outside world, so emergency workers decided to dig a tunnel so that they could install microphones to listen to what was happening inside the cave. As some of the group worried they'd hit a gas canister, one of the children, just 9 years old, was reportedly heard comforting her mother by saying, "Don't worry, there will be an explosion, and then we'll all be with God." When the authorities and press approached Kuznetsov, He had been joined by a few other members who had traveled far and wide from all over Russia. One member, Valery Mechev, initially hoped to join those underground, but he was too late. Speaking to reporters from Russia Today, he showed them his old passport as proof of his dedication. He explained that he had refused the new microchip version, adhering to the cult's belief that modern technology was the work of the devil. Mechev described his journey to Nikolskaya as a pilgrimage and paid his respects to those hidden beneath the earth, saying, "To find God down there means they've completed their mission in life. Those people understand the importance of seeking the spiritual truth. They may be underground, but they're saving themselves from the underworld. I admire them." One remarkable fact is how the members staying above ground with Kuznetsov would all sleep in pinewood coffins instead of beds. Kuznetsov initially refused to help the police or give any individuals names, but after an arrest and some convincing, shall we say, he suddenly agreed to speak to cult members and persuade them to leave. He exchanged letters with the group, but here's the twist: when he told them to come out, they refused, alleging that he was under the influence of the Russian government. The tactic of using agents to divide dissidents was something out of the Soviet government's playbook, and that was recent history still fresh in some members' minds. For the record, Western states have also done this to their own citizens. Examples including Operation Chaos in the 1970s in the USA and British government's actions during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The cult decided instead to elect a new temporary leader from the cave, known as Vitoli. This is the same Vitoli mentioned earlier in the story, Sergei's father. Now we'll get back to the cave in a second, but it was at this point the police decided Kuznetsov was no longer useful to them, and he was placed in custody and sent for psychiatric evaluation, while members who had arrived from Belarus or Ukraine were deported. One of them, before deportation, was quoted as saying, "The authorities will pay the price for forcing us to leave. You'll see the government actions will be accounted for, and if the authorities try to evict the people underground, then God will punish them. The biblical prophecy is coming true. The world will soon end." Kuznetsov was charged with starting an extremist organization, and even though he was diagnosed as schizophrenic, there was a lot of resentment towards him from the members of the public. On the night of January the 30th, 2008, he was beaten up by other patients on his ward. He was called the devil and condemned for indoctrinating children. In an interview with the media, Kuznetsov claimed he only told members to go underground because they were being harassed and assaulted by the local villagers, insisting that he wanted to join them once all his followers had arrived. Whatever his motives were, the people in the cave were not ready to come out and were prepared to wait patiently for Judgment Day to arrive. News of Kuznetsov's diagnosis had no effect on their resolve. They were adamant about completing their mission. By the end of March 2008, after cult members had been living in the cave for nearly 5 months, authorities were growing increasingly desperate. With the snow beginning to melt, they feared it would soon become a death trap, vulnerable as it was to flooding or even a mudslide. In a final effort to resolve the standoff, the authorities brought Kuznetsov back to the cave, hoping he might finally convince his followers to emerge. The attempt was not only unsuccessful, but also took a dangerous turn. The new leader, Vitoli, along with other armed men, fired shots from a rifle through the ventilation pipes that were being used to communicate with them. The shots were clearly intended to hit someone, not just to scare them away. Luckily, nobody was injured, but the authorities knew they'd have to approach the volatile situation more carefully. Whilst this was going on, Kuznetsov was also being investigated for violating Article 239 of the Criminal Code in Russia. He was also ordered to undergo compulsory treatment in a psychiatric ward. On March the 28th, the police took him out to the cave again, along with priests and rescue workers. This time their strategy was to address the needs of some of the injured cult members directly. 7 women from the group needed emergency medical care and had 2 children with them. One child was less than 2 years old. It's not clear what their emergencies were, but they eventually did come out of the cave. Because the authorities determined they hadn't really committed a crime, they were released after a health and wellness check. Concern still remained for the rest of the cult members. especially as the snow thawed and it had started raining. This was no drizzle, but heavy rain that was meant to last for a week. Eventually, it started causing mudslides towards the cave's entrance, and the high levels of moisture weakened the cave walls. The cultists later reported that chunks of soil started falling from the roof, so when the authorities approached them again on March the 31st, 14 more members agreed to emerge. All were released without charge after health and wellness checks. A few days later, in early April, Kuznetsov's prediction for the doomsday was fast approaching, but on April the 3rd, he attempted to take his own life by laying his head down on a tree stump, then using a large block of wood to bash in his own skull. He was found in this state, almost dead, whispering something which was reported as either reciting numbers or praying. He was in a coma for a week and had to have surgery, then remain in intensive care for almost a month before he was returned to the psychiatric hospital. Despite suffering from severe brain trauma and with his previous diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, the doctors believed he might recover sufficiently to stand trial. After news broke of the suicide attempt, a woman whom the cult called God's slave was seen weeping outside Kuznetsov's prayer house. It's unclear whether she was one of the followers who had lived with Kuznetsov above ground or one of those who had emerged early from the cave. Regardless, her faith in Father Pyotr remained unshaken. In fact, she claimed that he had died and been resurrected. After visiting him in the hospital, Nina even told the press that he had been reborn. When the news reached the cult members who remained in the cave, they declared that they were not ready to make any decisions and vowed to remain silent. It seems they interpreted their former leader's attempt at his own life as some kind of divine sign, further deepening their resolve to stay hidden underground. But the remaining cultists now faced the wrath of Mother Nature. On April the 23rd, heavy rain destroyed the entrance to the cave, and on May the 1st, it caused most of the roof to collapse. The remaining 11 continued to adhere so strictly to their vow of silence that authorities were unable to determine whether or not they were alive. It wasn't until May the 8th, when the singing of psalms was heard through the ventilation shafts, that contact was made again, and the group confirmed its intention to stay put until May the 28th, when the world would end. But this would not be what happened, because on May the 16th, 2008, 9 surviving members emerged from the cave for a very dark reason. The bodies of 2 dead members had created toxic fumes and a disgusting stench which had nowhere to go due to the poor ventilation. Officials reported that this stench could be smelled even from standing near the cave. But who were these 2 dead members? Well, when authorities finally entered the cave, they found one woman who had died from cancer, unable to get treatment, and another who had died from severe malnutrition. The interior of the cave was in an abysmal state and not fit for anyone to live in. The tunnels were damp and dark. Unsanitary bedding lined the small cells. A kitchen with open buckets of drinking water was located right next to a toilet. One area was arranged for children with a chess set and some books. In the prayer area, a Russian Orthodox cross had been placed next to where the 2 women's bodies were found. Shortly after the corpses were removed, the cave was demolished to discourage thrill-seekers and tourists from flocking to the village. But despite all that, Father Pyotr's followers still refused to return home and instead resided at the little commune, waiting for the apocalypse to come. Meanwhile, Kuznetsov was readmitted to a psychiatric clinic following his stay in the intensive care unit. A Penza region court officially declared his religious writings illegal. Kuznetsov had published several manifestos with print runs of around 17,000 copies, which he used to attract new followers. An assistant in the local prosecutor's office explained that investigators had conducted a psychological and linguistic analysis of the books confiscated from Kuznetsov. According to specialists, the writings contained both latent and overt promotion of religious and racial intolerance. These findings led to charges being brought against him. On July the 15th, the first court sessions were scheduled to take place. However, the court quickly determined that Kuznetsov was too mentally and physically unfit to attend the hearings. Although Kuznetsov had already been declared legally insane, the court needed to assess his mental state at the time he ordered his followers to go underground. Since 2 people had died, he faced trial in a criminal court. Ultimately, the judge found him guilty of the deaths of his followers, but due to his mental illness, he was not sentenced to prison. Instead, he was ordered to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment. As of 2012, the whereabouts of Kuznetsov were unknown. As for the remaining few cultists, they remained true to Father Pyotr's teachings. They refused to grow any food because they believed the apocalypse was imminent, and accepting packaged food went against their beliefs. Although they were provided with fresh food and even a cow, this act of generosity angered the local community, which was struggling with poverty themselves. Not much information is available on what happened after that. Social services intervened several times over the 3 years following these events, seeking to persuade the members to go back home to their families or get help, but they would always be met with silence. The only notable response came from a female cult member who was interviewed by the press. She said, "There is no need to teach us. We can confirm every word by the scriptures. The end of the world is coming, though it might take 3 more years for it to finally die." Another member who was just 15 years old stated, "The prophet will be resurrected and the good will live in a world of light." Over the years, most of the sect members left Nikolskaya except for a couple and their 3 children, who, as of 2012, were continuing to live without electricity and passports, still waiting and praying to God over imminent end of the world. Thank you for listening.